Thank you so much, Nathan, for inviting me. It sort of livens up my Sunday because we don't actually have anything synchronous at my own church at all. And sometimes you just miss people, and after sort of watching a lot of YouTube videos, you're like, I actually just want to see like my church people on the screen and have conversations with each other. So it's really a privilege to be with you and to get to share some of this conversation with you. The way I'm planning to go about this is that I'm going to pause for questions at multiple times because it's very tedious to just listen to someone talk at you. So if you have an urgent question, feel free to wave your hands wildly or put it in the chat. And I certainly don't mind being interrupted, but I'm going to be deliberately pausing at several points during the hour for us to have some discussion. So don't worry that I'm just going to monologue at you for a solid hour. And my plan also, I think, is that although I'm going to be introducing some prayer practices, I think I'm going to be encouraging you to try them out on your own in between this time and Compline. My own experience of trying to sort of like do prayer practices on Zoom has been that it's kind of awkward and miserable. And it may be that some of you are more advanced in that than I am and have found that works perfectly fine for you. But for me, it just tends to like produce anxiety. And so I think we're just gonna like not actually do prayer together, but we'll talk about prayer and then give you some time for individual prayer before Compline begins. So in the Bible, 1 Thessalonians 5:17 instructs us to pray continually. And that's not actually even that much of an anomalous verse. Romans 12:12 tells us that we're supposed to be constant in prayer. Luke 18:1 says that we should pray at all times and not give up. And my suspicion is that if I sort of asked most of you what that means, you might be inclined to say, well, I mean, obviously it doesn't mean that literally, right? This is just sort of a nice dramatic overstatement. We aren't really supposed to pray continually or at all times, just sort of like a generalized, pray in all circumstances, but not literally in all times. Well, the interesting thing here is that in general, folks in the early church were not renowned for taking the Bible literally. Um, the primary way of reading scripture really was spiritually or allegorically. But when it came to these verses, most people agreed that, like, no, that's literally what it means. It's literally what you're supposed to do is pray all the time. And there's a saying that I like from the sayings of the Desert Fathers that says, someone who just prays at the specific times when they set out to pray basically doesn't pray at all. The idea being that this is supposed to be something that's so automatic, so deeply ingrained within you, that you actually basically are praying at all times, even at the times when you're not fully conscious of it. That like there is sort of a small part of your brain that is quietly repeating prayers, often in tune with your breath, and that, your very life has become sort of a prayer itself. Now, this is the boring part, but I think this is important. Part of this comes down to the way in which we use words in English, right? And like, what do we even mean when we say prayer? In general, early Christians are really talking about three separate kinds of things, and it's very helpful to differentiate them. So the first thing we have is the liturgy and the Psalms. And here's the thing. This took me like way too long to learn, but like, you're not exactly supposed to pray the liturgy. I spent some time in an Episcopal convent, fresh out of college, and I could tell you so many nun stories. I just love nuns, but I just remember how horrified the Mother Superior was when she realized that I was sort of trying to pray and really trying to feel and to mean every single word of the Psalms. And she was just like, my gosh, child, isn't that exhausting? I was like, yes, it is. It's very exhausting. And the way she explained it is that the liturgical prayer of the church, like the daily office and the Psalter and even the Eucharistic liturgy, is much more like practicing scales, and prayer is improv. Now, you need both. I mean, it would be cool if we were all just sort of like the spiritual equivalent of a musical genius and we could just sit down at the piano and play amazing improv. But that's not the way it goes for most of us. I'm open to the possibility that like maybe there are some spiritual geniuses out there who can do that. But that's not actually the way that most of us have to learn prayer. We learn prayer by practicing. And reciting the Psalms, reciting the daily office becomes that way of actually almost learning a new language. It's sort of the equivalent of doing grammatical exercises. It's not very exciting always. Sometimes it is. I actually very genuinely love the daily office, but sometimes it's really boring. Just like, doing your grammatical paradigms is boring or practicing your scales is boring. But that's the thing that gives you the fluency to actually be able to speak on your own, to write your own compositions, to do creative and interesting things. And in some ways, liturgical prayer isn't actually so much about us speaking to God as it is God speaking to us, right? Much of Christian liturgy historically, and especially Episcopal liturgy, actually is basically quotes from the Bible all strung together. And it's the kind of thing that, like you all may have heard the old joke about, the woman who says that like, she really quite likes the Bible, especially when it quotes the Book of Common Prayer. And there's so much scripture in the liturgy that many of us are actually so used to, we don't even recognize it as being quotes from scripture. We recognize it as being prayer book. But it's like, that's not our language. That's God's language given to us. And then there is sort of, colloquy or petitionary prayer, which is when we speak to God. But beyond both of those things, there is the kind of prayer for the wordless and imageless prayer that is simply us resting in the presence of God. And usually, especially in the desert tradition of monastic spirituality, when they say prayer, that's what they mean. They don't mean liturgical prayer, and they don't mean petitionary or intercessory prayer. They mean silent prayer and being still in the presence of God. Now, the bad news is, for most of us, again, because we're not spiritual geniuses, you can't just like snap your fingers and be instantly in the direct presence of God without using words or imagination, right? It just doesn't work that way. The imagination is like a hungry creature. And if you don't give it some quality food to chew on, it feeds on junk. Now, I know next week you're going to be talking about icons. And so this tiny bit here is just a teaser trailer, because it's an analogous thing, actually. This early Christian tradition would have said, the imagination is actually quite dangerous in prayer. It's dangerous to sort of imagine the image of God, because the chances that you're going to end up creating God in your own image are unfortunately astonishingly high, right? I mean, that's just the way human beings are built. And something that I have frequently encountered with my undergraduates, actually, more than with my priestlings when I was teaching in seminaries. But, with my undergraduates, I often have students who are very devoutly Christian, but have never read the Bible before. And they're very offended by the Jesus that's portrayed in the Bible. And every single semester, I have multiple students insisting to me that, like, Jesus just wouldn't say these things because these are not Christ-like things, and Jesus wouldn't say things that are very unkind, like telling people that they're sinners. And I'm like, well, there's a lot going on there. But what's fascinating to me is that people seem to have a very defined belief of like who Jesus is that is completely independent of what's in the Bible. And, it's like, how do we get that? Well, through the imagination. But the whole reason that the tradition of icons developed was the realization that like we actually do need something. Um, you don't necessarily want to give free rein to your imagination, but if you don't have some kind of image, some kind of thing for your brain to chew on, it's gonna fabricate something. That's just how it works. Part of what just comes with having a brain, right? And the Jesus prayer also is a way of disciplining the mind and actually also the body through the breath so that it becomes possible to rest in the presence of God. I'm going to tell you just one more thing before I pause for questions. One of the traditions I really love, although not all Episcopal churches do it, but I really love the all-night vigil on Maundy Thursday before the Reserved Sacrament. And in pre-pandemic times, of course, I really would stay there all night. And it's not like because I am so deeply devout, it's that I usually needed several hours of me monologuing at God before I could finally be quiet and listen to God, right? Like I actually needed the space of the entire night to get through everything that I had to say. And then finally could be still. And in some ways, tools like the Jesus prayer are sort of like prayer hacks for short-circuiting that process, where they help you to slow your mind down and to quiet your mind without having to go through like the whole long protracted process of monologuing at God before you can finally be still. So I'm very aware that I haven't yet even told you exactly what the Jesus prayer is, and that is the second segment that we're going to do. But I do want to pause now and see if there's any questions or reactions or things that you want to raise for discussion. I do see a hand.
Yeah, I think one of the things really touched me with when you'd spoken about prayer being continuous, and I've never thought that is something that I was conscious of, but I have found, particularly in the last 10 years when I've been more conscious of it, that there'd be times of the day where I was listening to God, communing with God, or even laughing with God about something that had happened, whether it be a difficult time. And for me, during the periods where I may find it time to slow down and consciously pray and listen to God, those have given me great consolation, knowing that through the day, God may pop in and out, or God is probably there the whole time. I'm recognizing it, but the ability to, or the knowledge that you can stop your life for a second and realize, yeah, God is saying something to me right now. And, maybe we'll have a chuckle together. Maybe he's pointing out something I need to be looking at. But that has particularly helped me during periods when I find it hard to slow myself down and be still.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, well, continue to think of questions because I will be pausing again. In its final form, as it sort of comes to be handed down to us now, the Jesus prayer is actually fairly late. The text that made it the most famous is a 19th century Russian text called The Way of the Pilgrim. And in some ways, it really became popularized in like the 13th and 14th centuries. But it does have its origins in this movement of the early Desert Fathers and Mothers. And I'm so tempted to go on an excursus right now and tell you all about the origins of desert monasticism, and I'm totally going to do that. But I think first I should tell you what the Jesus Prayer is, because I think it's a little bit cruel that I've made it 18 minutes into this thing and I haven't actually even yet told you what the thing is. So first I will explain to you the actual prayer practice before I just tell you more fun stories about monks and nuns. So basically what this is it's a kind of repetitive way of praying using what's called a mantra and using your breath. So there's a couple of different forms. The one that's usually recommended for beginners, and the one that I actually still find the most helpful, is Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And you breathe in during the first half and you breathe out during the second half. So breathing in, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, breathing out, have mercy on me, a sinner. Now, why is that the one recommended for beginners? The short version actually is that it's long. There are some people prefer the versions of this that are less penitential. So for example, Jesus Christ, have mercy on me is a common way that people also pray it. And that is actually, it's considered basically a more advanced form of the same prayer. And it's not advanced because advanced people don't need to repent and beginners need to repent. It's more advanced because it's short. And it's actually harder to do the breath control on something short. So this is actually a purely practical thing. This is not a theological difference. I find the longer one helpful because I find that if I do the short one, I end up going through it far too quickly. And then I'm like breathing in and breathing out really fast. And I'm basically hyperventilating. And that's just not helpful, right? The whole point is that we're trying to like slow our breath down and be calm and collected about this whole thing. So I need the long one. When you do this, it actually, because of the breath especially, it becomes the kind of thing where after a while you actually do it almost automatically. And I will frequently fall asleep praying it. And honestly, it just, again, this is probably not very spiritually enlightened, but it's very pragmatic. This is a really good way to fall asleep at night. It helps you quiet your mind down and like fall asleep. But what actually happens then is that I wake up praying it in the morning. And it's like your brain actually continues it even as you're sleeping. And I do find that because this is something that I make a habit of doing, not only during deliberately set aside times of prayer during the day, but also, you know, like when you're waiting in line at the grocery store, if you have a really long commute in the car or on the bus. When you use those times profitably for this, it just kind of seeps into you. And then it becomes the kind of thing that like you do automatically. And, you know, I've never actually like had any kind of surgery, but I've actually heard multiple people tell me that like they woke up from surgery and being under anesthesia, like praying the Jesus prayer because they went out while they were praying it. And so like they woke up and it's like still basically on their lips. And when this tradition first developed, one of the things that's interesting is that most of the monks and nuns who developed this tradition said also that not only do you need words, but you actually probably need to be doing something with your hands, some kind of repetitive motion thing. And so the practice in early desert monasticism is that they would actually weave mats and then they would like sell them in the market. Tangent, but I've just always wondered about this because there seems to have been a huge market demand for reed mats in Egypt that just seems to me completely disproportionate to how many reed mats anyone could possibly need. And I've always been sort of perplexed by this. But anyway, your monks and your nuns would just sit there and they would weave as they were praying. And what gradually evolved, because I guess eventually actually the world had enough reed mats and they just didn't need any more of those. And so you had the invention of what's called a prayer rope. So I'm holding one of these here. In some ways, it's similar to a rosary, and you actually could use a rosary to do the same thing. But this is an Orthodox prayer rope. It is made out of wool. It has 33 knots, and you use that basically in theory to count, but I've never paid any attention to how many times I've said the Jesus prayer, right? It's much more about having something to physically do with your hands, because in general, human beings are fidgety, and it's just a thing, right? And there are traditions of prayer and meditation that will sort of try to teach you to be perfectly still and to discipline that tendency. But this tradition actually isn't one of them. This tradition would say, no, you need to be doing something with your hands, preferably something repetitive. Knitting would actually work really well, crocheting. I know people who have more artistic talent than I have, who really like to draw or to doodle when they're doing this. But it's something that sort of engages your brain, your body as well as your brain. And but you don't want it to be too involved, right? You want it to be something that is repetitive, something that actually basically just kind of helps rein you in by focusing. And I'll tell you one more just fun thing, and then I will actually pause again to see if there's any questions on that. But I've taught at a couple of universities in the Orthodox world. And that's where this tradition really comes from and is still the most prominent. And one of the things that just always amused me is that most people would have a prayer rope that they would either wear around their wrist or that they would carry in their hand. And I would often look around at really boring faculty meetings, and every single professor was like praying with their prayer rope. And it's sort of like, well, on the one hand, we're all cultivating our spiritual life and we're all becoming very holy. On the other hand, I don't think anyone is listening to the rollout of the new assessment plan. And it's just sort of like, well, and the benefit is that, if you end up at a really boring work meeting, you can just sort of sit there, you can pray your Jesus prayer, you can turn inward and cultivate your interior life. And actually, you might leave that terrible work meeting feeling much more charitable and kindly disposed towards the world in general than if you'd actually listened to everything that was being said. I tell my students that I hope they don't need to do this in my classes, but that this is a great thing that they can do in their more boring classes, and just sort of like, rather than just be bored and cranky and mad that you have to be there, like use the time profitably. So let me pause there because I feel like I may have rushed that a bit. And so if you have questions, on how this works. I think I saw a hand from Linda.
I'm unmuting the wrong way. When you mentioned Jesus prayer, my mind went straight to the 30-year rector of my last parish, a guy named Jim Adams, who founded the Center for Progressive Christianity. He used to start every day at the neighborhood pool, and he would swim laps to Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me, a sinner. He left out the Son of God part, and I think he made a whole lap. He would do that for half an hour to start his day. And I like the idea of the prayer rope. I had an old boss once who said, the phrase, about, well, I clocked him once because this was how I kept my attention kind of on him, was I would just count the number, mark on a pad, the number every time he said, but I think the prayer rope works better. I got him at 11 and 30 minutes, but anyway, that's all.
I love it. Thank you.
Not so much a question as just a comment.
Yeah, thank you.
I've also found the times that I've used the Jesus prayer, or really, there was a period of my life where that was one of my main forms of prayer. It was almost always while walking. And while, it wasn't just something to do with my hands, just the active movement and kind of tie that sense of inner physical rhythm and spiritual mental rhythm. Just really helped me kind of sink into that place of presence and awareness.
There is an Episcopal rosary that is much, much shorter than the one that we recognize as the Roman Catholic rosary. And one of the things that they suggest you do is that there, like any rosary, there are breaks in it so that you don't say the same thing endlessly forever. So you wake yourself up with the break. But there's that repetition, and that repetition of Jesus Christ, have mercy of me, a sinner, is one of the ones that they recommend that you repeat as you go around the prayer. And it's really very, very comforting. It's like having a friend with you, probably Jesus.
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
You know, and it is, the Anglican rosary was invented fairly recently, just a few decades ago, but it's basically what would happen if you took a Catholic rosary and like smashed it into an Orthodox prayer rope, because it's 33 beads, just like an Orthodox prayer rope has 33 knots. And you can either use sort of like these Orthodox prayers with it, or you can use more rosary-like prayers with it. And it's sort of versatile in that way. So I have one that I like a lot. I like, you know, the traditional Orthodox prayer ropes because I just like the feel of the wool for whatever reason.
Mhm.
And that is not like there, you know, there's nothing like, that's just a personal preference. Some people really, really like beads and the way that like beads feel. People have very strong preferences based on whether like the beads are movable versus immobile, you know. And so with all of those things, it's just sort of like you can try a few out. I have way too many like prayer toys for my own good, but I'll often just like, you know, bring them all into class. So we have sort of like show and tell, and, you know, people just try out different ones. And it's fascinating to me actually that most people instinctively have very strong personal preferences about this, when like, you know, it should be like a completely neutral thing that most people had no idea they had strong preferences until they tried out like 10 things. And then they realize that they think one is like strongly superior. So, yeah.
Question. Like Steve, I was touched by your idea of the continuous presence to hear God. But I also know that I'm a human being that can be very reactive, and it doesn't take much to distract me. And so I guess I'm curious about what are the ways that we can shift back into that slower down despite all of the distractions that seem to show up a lot?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I mean, for me, and I mean, this is me being sort of like a quasi nun, but I actually do find it really helpful to have several very short set times for prayer throughout the day. And to me, they don't have to be long. It's not that you're sort of like, you know, trying to do spiritual heroics and sort of prove how much you can pray, but it's a question of sort of deliberately pausing at various points. And, you know, in some ways, so I actually converted to Christianity while I was living in Egypt as an undergraduate, which is its own whole story. But in some ways, this idea of pausing multiple times a day for prayer is something that I actually first learned from Islam, and only later learned that there's a very long Christian tradition also, especially within monastic communities. But I just loved that because, you know, you would have sort of like the call to prayer go off 5 times a day, and the Muslims would go off and do their prayer, and I would also pause and do my prayer. And like, I actually really loved it. And, you know, I'm currently teaching remotely, but this was something that I loved actually about teaching at a Benedictine college, because you'll hear the bells go off multiple times a day for prayer. And I wouldn't always be able to attend, because just because it's a Benedictine college doesn't mean that like they arrange the schedule such that, you know, all employees could just drop everything and go to all of the prayer services. I wish. But even just, you know, when you have sort of cues like that, where you're like, oh, this is time. We need to pull ourselves back. I do find visual reminders very helpful. So, most of these are in my office, but I do have lots of icons, which you'll get to hear about next week. And, I turned an entire wall of my office into like a giant iconostasis where it's all icons. But it's the kind of thing where, I guess at a certain point, maybe one can become used to it, and then like maybe it's just art. But I often find that they do catch my eye at particular points and actually really do draw me back. And I think for me, it's partly because I'm a person, both in terms of my job and in terms of just like how I am, where I often get lost in words and like lots of reading books and lots of thinking thoughts and sort of like that sort of thing. And so for me, visual images can actually be a way of sort of startling me back into presence, I guess, to God in a way that like maybe words would work for some other people, but like literally all I do every day is read theology, right? So like at a certain point, it's like I almost have become like numb to the effects of words. But there are other things, such as art, that can still bring me up short. And yeah, the very last one. I will just go ahead and tell you, although this is of questionable licity, but especially during this time of pandemic, I actually do keep the Reserved Sacrament in my home, not to consume, but actually just to venerate. And I'm completely prepared to make a canonical case for why that is licit. It is not explicitly forbidden, and I have a case, but we don't need to go into that unless anyone cares. But for me, that's actually been incredibly important because I am a person with a very high Eucharistic theology. And, here we haven't had any kind of Eucharist in over a year now. But simply having it present for me has actually made all the difference in the world. All the difference in the world. And, even after, I've had that here since August now. It's actually still very powerful for me. Sometimes I worry that like maybe I'm actually very spiritually immature and I'm sort of like the equivalent of a child who can't go to sleep without a nightlight on. But it's just made a tremendous amount of difference. And I think that like physical things basically matter. And so whether it is, whether it is an icon, whether it is a prayer rope, whether it is, okay, this is like sort of a drastic intervention, but for a while, mid-pandemic, my habit of praying the daily office was like completely just fell apart. And so what I actually did was I like physically set up an altar like literally in the middle of my apartment so that I basically couldn't walk from one end to another without tripping over it. And then it's sort of like when you have Bible and prayer book and candle and it's like literally right there in the middle. It's like, fine, okay, I'm gonna do the thing. And I think sometimes like just those very physical ways of arranging space becomes the kind of thing that is helpful in terms of pulling us back to the presence of God. So that was tons of rambling, but hopefully I said something helpful in all of that.
Thank you.
Other questions or thoughts? Okay, let me tell you a little bit about desert monasticism. Because that's where, in some ways, this whole tradition grows out of. When monasticism sort of gets started, as it were, your traditional narrative is that it's founded by basically two guys who found different kinds of monasticism. There's Anthony, who founds the kind of monasticism where you could basically go live by yourself in a hut or in a cave, but maybe there's like a community of people around who are all in their little caves and you can kind of see each other on the distance. And then there's Pachomius, who sets up the more sort of communal style of monasticism, where it's almost like a major miniature city and everyone sort of lives in dormitories, and they do organized work together and organized prayer together, and it's really sort of like an institution. Pachomius, by the way, former soldier, totally set this up along the lines of the military. It's just like the new pacifist military, where instead of taking up arms, you just pray a lot. Here's the thing, though. Even in the life of Saint Anthony, when Anthony goes off into the desert to like found monasticism, he sticks his sister in a convent. Now, you'll have some people who read that and they're like, well, that's weird and anachronistic. And clearly that was just added later because there were no convents, because he hadn't founded monasticism, right? Increasingly, though, the historical evidence actually is that women's religious communities came first. And then, like, you know, a couple hundred years later, a couple of guys come along and found monasticism, and they get to get all the credit. And of course, that's just totally how it works. But what we do know is that certainly as early as the 1st century, and you see this in the letters of Paul, there were people choosing not to marry and devoting themselves to celibacy. And if you were a man, like, you could just do that. You know, it was fine. Like, you could still have a job, you could still support yourself. And men also actually married much later. And so it wasn't necessarily like a big social deal. People were like, oh, you know, it's a guy in his 20s or 30s who's not married yet, but maybe he's just not married yet, you know. But if you're a girl who's marriageable, meaning like 12 to 14, and you decide that you're not going to get married, sort of like, well, now what do we do with her? This is very inconvenient. Like, she can't just like stay around her father's house for forever. That might work for a while, but her father may not particularly like this idea, and eventually her father's going to die, and you can't just like have a woman living by herself. How is she going to make a living? How's any of this going to work? And so what does seem to be the case, actually, is that quite early you had communities of women who never married, and also of widows who would move into households together, and basically had developed some kind of monasticism long before these guys came along. Now, the kind of desert monasticism that we know more about was founded by primarily people who were not literate. And therefore, a lot of the prayer tradition that they developed, which includes things like the Jesus prayer, was primarily oral and intended to be able to be done, you know, by people with or without formal education. So this is not like your highly literate medieval monasticism that consists of, like, you know, choir monks reading psalms in choir and copying manuscripts and stuff. This is definitely a much more manual labor type of monasticism by people who would memorize good chunks of scripture, especially the Psalter, and do manual labor. But, you know, you couldn't really have, you know, a tradition of like extensive Bible study, for example, because people probably couldn't read. And they were often leading rather solitary lives. And so they weren't necessarily listening to anyone else read the Bible. That being said, for much of this tradition, you actually couldn't even be clothed as a novice until you had the entire Psalter memorized. So, you know, that puts most of us to shame, because I think most of us don't have. You know, even I actually did memorize most of it during my convent days, especially because it was chanted, and it's easier to memorize when it's sung. But to this day, I will hear psalms and be like, I swear I've never heard that before. Like, that's not in the Psalter. And invariably, I will look it up, and it's one of the ones that was assigned for matins, which we prayed at like 6 a.m. And I'm like, well, that explains it. You know, it's like I was there, but I clearly wasn't really there. You know, I mean, we can say that at 6 a.m., you know, every week for years, and it still won't really seep in. So let me tell you about my 2 favorite figures in this tradition very briefly. One of them is this guy named Evagrius. For those of you who do Lent Madness, he recently showed up in Lent Madness, but I thought his bio was a little unfair to him. Evagrius is like the one true love of my life, despite the fact that he's celibate and dead. These are minor impediments to our eternal happiness. All of my books by him just have all of these little hearts and stars in the margins. And I'm like, nobody understands me like Evagrius understands me. I've never seen like such a good understanding of just pure human psychology. So basically what's important about Evagrius is that he was very highly educated, was pretty much on the fast track to a very promising ecclesiastical career. He was a fairly newly ordained deacon, but it was obvious to everyone that he was sort of on the fast track to becoming bishop. He'd studied with all of the best people. He was, personal secretary to all of the coolest bishops. Then he had a little bit of a personal crisis when he definitely fell in love with and possibly slept with a married woman. Not entirely clear exactly what happened, but like, if he didn't commit adultery, he definitely really wanted to. So, certainly within his heart, he was all in. And this plunged him deep into spiritual crisis. And he ended up in the monastery of a woman named Melania. And direly ill, but all of the doctors came to see him and they were like, there's nothing wrong with you. Totally fine. I don't know what your problem is. And so Melania just looks at him and is like, yeah, okay, so what did you do? And he confesses everything. And she actually tonsures him as a monk and sends him off to Egypt. And so the reason that Evagrius is important for us is that he's one of the people who actually really synthesizes this indigenous tradition of Egyptian monasticism that was largely Coptic speaking, largely not literate. And he takes it and sort of fuses it with the best of Greek philosophy. And so you sort of get the best of both worlds combined into one. The other figure that's really important here, I will say less about, but this is someone named John Cashion. And he is one of the people who is most responsible for spreading this tradition to Western Europe. And I've always said that I want to take the John Cashion route to becoming a saint, because basically what he did is he and his friend, Germanus, just went and wandered around the Egyptian desert and they interviewed a whole bunch of like really holy and wise people and they wrote it all down and then we canonized him. I'm like, this is brilliant. So this is like totally my path to sanctity. Like all I have to do is find like a bunch of really wise monks and nuns and interview them. And I put it all in a book and then I become a saint. It's like the best deal. So the thing I most want to tell you about Cashion is that he is one of our earliest people to report this tradition of something like the Jesus prayer. But he actually has a completely different formula because things were not yet set in stone. People were still making this up. And so the mantra that he reports early monks and nuns using is derived from the Psalms, but you might also recognize it from the prayer book, which is, "O God, make speed to save us. O Lord, make haste to help us." So that's actually a very similar thing where, you say, "O God, make speed to save us" while breathing in. "O Lord, make haste to help us" while breathing out. And you can actually use that in the same way as a kind of repetitive prayer. And this is something that, I think can be particularly helpful for people who don't necessarily like the penitential tone of the original, or not the original, actually, the one that's become more common, right? So, "Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner." Just for the record, I love the penitential stuff. I'm all about it. Lent is like my favorite season of the liturgical year. I want to Lent 365 days a year. But I also know that that's not where everyone's at spiritually. We're all in different places. And for some people, the penitential language is not necessarily helpful. And so this alternative formula actually allows you to have basically the same kind of prayer practice in a way that might be more helpful if, maybe you have like enough Lent in your life and you're tired of acknowledging and bewailing your manifold sins and wickedness. And so, there are ways in which you can use the same kind of prayer practice, and actually, also find your own. Like maybe there's a line from the Psalms that really speaks to you that you want to be able to use in the same way, and you can also do that. And so, in that sense, it's actually very flexible. Now, let me pause again briefly and see if there's any questions or thoughts. Yeah, I see Julie has a hand, but is muted.
Okay, I'm into centering prayer, and I thought that centering prayer, what was it started with the Desert Fathers? Is that correct?
It comes out of the same tradition. Absolutely.
Okay. Mhm.
What I would be inclined to say is that centering prayer is arguably more advanced, and there's a huge debate that I actually have no opinion on, but it's about whether or not that's the right starting place for people.
Mhm.
And the idea being that like many people actually need more in terms of words and images and physical things to do before going where centering prayer takes you. And I don't necessarily feel like I'm spiritually wise enough to have a stake in that whole particular debate. But I think for some people, centering prayer can just be too difficult, and they need. I need actually. I do feel like I can speak about my own spiritual life. I tend to need something that offers like more words and more structure than what centering prayer has. But
And one more question: the prayer of the heart.
Yeah.
How does that fit into this?
Good. So they would say that that this is designed to basically lead you into the prayer of the heart, and to sort of like quiet your thoughts. And the language they use actually talks about sort of like drawing your brain down into the heart, which in a way I find odd, but in a way I'm like, no, that actually kind of makes sense to me. And so it's like you sort of like help to quiet your thoughts by drawing your brain down into your heart, and then that allows you to enter into the prayer of the heart.
I think they're buddies.
Yeah.
The brain and the heart.
Yep.
And they work together, and sometimes it's one, sometimes it's the other.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so we've got 10 minutes, and I think that's enough time for me to tell you this next part, just because this is like one of my favorite things. But this gets a little complicated, but I think you'll get the general idea. And this comes out of the teachings of Evagrius. So Evagrius would say that even with something like this Jesus prayer, you arguably can't just sit down and do it. You actually, in some ways, need the liturgy first to clear your heart and your mind for prayer. And I'm very aware that what we're all about to imminently do is do this in reverse. And I'm going to send you off for like 30 minutes of Jesus prayer or whatever you want to do. And then you're going to have liturgy. And that's technically like completely backwards. But you can always do it again after the liturgy. But here's the part that I think will be strange to you, but increasingly makes sense to me. Evagrius, following a lot of Greek philosophy here, said that like basically, in addition to our rational mind, we have two main faculties, anger and desire. And both of these are good. Both of these are good things. Now, this is rarely the way that we talk about desire, but it's almost never the way we talk about anger. And one of the things that's fascinating to me, and in theory, this is a book project, but I'm not sure if I'm wise enough to write the book. But it's sort of fascinating to me that anger eventually becomes a sin in the Christian tradition. And it doesn't really start out as one. Even with the tradition of the 7 deadly sins, which starts out as 8, those are originally called the 7 capital sins, which means that they're the 7 sources of sin. Not that these are like the 7 worst bad things you could do, but that these are the 7 things that can lead you to sin. Sadness was also on the original list. And that one fell off because people were like, well, obviously sadness is not a sin, right? And I would actually put anger in the same category as sadness, of like, these are things that can absolutely 8,000% lead us into sin, but they're arguably not inherently sinful. And, you know, I mean, we see Jesus doing all kinds of things like getting angry and casting people out of temples. And Christians have historically taught that Jesus is sinless, right? Cursing poor little fig trees, etc. And so desire is given to us so that we would desire God and desire what is good and desire virtue. Why might we have anger? Basically, to fight against anything that keeps you from the good. For most of the Christian tradition, what that primarily meant is demons. Now, I'm not going to try, especially not with 6 minutes left, to launch into a theological discussion about whether or not demons exist, although that would be quite interesting and not what you thought you were coming to this evening. Here's what I am going to tell you. For as long as Christians did believe that demons existed, there was an appropriate target for anger. And I don't know that Christians who sort of got rid of demons really thought through the role that they sort of played in the theological ecosystem. Because if you go through and decide like, we don't like demons, that's not rational, we're not comfortable with that, and you go through and exterminate all of the demons, then what do you do with the anger that was originally there to be directed at the demons, right? And, you know, I did some research on this at the Harvard University Library, and I'm not even kidding you. They categorize all of their books on demons under the heading of superstitions and delusions. I'm like, okay, Harvard, tell us what you really thought about that. But, you know, the idea here is that the liturgy, especially the Psalms, is designed to get you to express all of your desire and all of your anger and get it all out of your system. And you're supposed to like feel every bit of it. And one of my biggest frustrations actually with the 79 prayer book is that like, there's a lot of really great angry parts in the Psalms and they put them in brackets or sometimes cut them out altogether because they're like, oh, this makes us very uncomfortable and we don't really like that. Well, yeah, if you imagine praying those against people, that should make you uncomfortable. But if you imagine them, you know, praying them against the cosmic forces of wickedness, however you want to personify those, then it makes all the sense in the world, right? And if you don't like thinking of them as literal demons, think about praying those against like structural racism or, you know, mass incarceration or any of those other sort of like big systemic evils, because then it gives like an actual target and focus to anger. And this I think, you know, this is very counterintuitive for how you probably are used to thinking about liturgy. But what this desert tradition would say is that liturgical prayer is another way of preparing yourself for this kind of contemplative prayer, because it allows you to take all of that desire and all of that anger and get it all out of your system. I could say more, but we've got 3 minutes, and I think I want to see if there's any more questions. I think Nicole had a hand.
Yes, I have one, Liza. I am very into thinking about anger in general, but also desire in the Christian ecosystem. So if one were to like start with a primer on Evagrius, because I have never even heard of him, what would you recommend to someone?
His best and most accessible work is called The Practicos, and it's bound together with a little book called Chapters on Prayer. So I'm just putting that in the chat actually for everyone. And that the whole book is only about 100 pages long. The introduction is much longer. To be honest, I would skip the introduction and just go straight into the text. But it's actually very accessible. I read it with undergraduates and they love it. And so, yeah, that's definitely my favorite. And there are some of his other works that are much more advanced that are also really cool, but like he has some intensely philosophical ones talking about how all the demons are going to get saved, which makes me really happy. But like the one that's actually useful for your spiritual life and like talking about anger and desire, that's the Practicos. So yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, Margaret has a hand, but is muted.
Yes, sorry. I missed the second mantra prayer that you shared as I got, oh God makes me.
Okay, oh God, make speed to save us.
Make speed.
Yep.
Make speed.
And oh Lord, make haste to help us.
Got it.
Now that's the translation from the Book of Common Prayer. And so, to be honest, I couldn't even tell you which Psalm it's in, but it's in the Psalms. But, I primarily know it from the prayer book because that's just how Anglican I am, right? So then that's the translation that I more naturally quote, but, you would find others for sure.
It's sort of interesting to think of my anger as being a very spiritual activity.
Yeah, this is not how I was taught to think about anger.
I'm very intrigued by what you're saying.
Yeah, it is. This is something that like I've been thinking about a lot recently and haven't like entirely figured out. But I think in some ways we've tried so hard to make people be nice rather than virtuous. And that isn't necessarily the most helpful thing. And so it's, and I've realized like in some ways, I actually think I probably need more anger, like rightly directed. I think in some ways it's like that's what you need to actually make you get out of bed every day and like do stuff and change things and make things better and not just sort of like give in to despair when the world's not the way it ought to be. It's like that faculty. I think we've focused probably too much on desire and on the ordering of desires and not enough on sort of like this other half of things.
Yeah, you're really speaking to me. I can't wait to read the book you're going to write about this.
I wonder if there isn't a difference between anger at the way we think the world ought to be and the world the way we personally want it to be.
Yeah. Well, and it is, both anger and desire basically get us into trouble when we direct them at the wrong objects, right? Yeah. So it's like, desire is good when it is desire for God and desire for the good, but we often direct our desires at lesser things, whether it's alcohol or food or sex or anything else that's not God. And likewise, anger, we often end up directing against other human beings or against ourselves or against things that are actually not going to be helpful there either. And so it's a matter of sort of like targeting each faculty where it's meant to be targeted rather than just sort of like indiscriminately aiming both of them at the wrong things. Maybe I'll tell you one last thing to close. This is something, this was sort of too half-baked to really put in the talk, but that verse in 1 Thessalonians where it says to pray continually, I was sort of thinking, well, the very next verse is give thanks in all circumstances. And isn't it weird that this whole tradition of prayer focuses only on the praying continually and not on the giving thanks in all circumstances? Then I went and actually started looking more at my text, and they totally do. the giving thanks in all circumstances is totally there. I'm the one who didn't see it. So I think that's like my issue going on there. But that was sort of, it was a jarring thing to realize, because I was like, wow, this is so weird that they take this one part of First Thessalonians completely out of context and they never talk about giving thanks. And then I went back and like every single text, it's totally there. So I'm like, I didn't see it there, despite having read most of those multiple times. So that's interesting and something that I'm probably going to have to think on a lot more. But I think that is like part of things also. You know, it's not just saying, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. It is also saying, you know, thank you for all of the things that thank you that you do have mercy on me, a sinner, right? And for all of the other ways that God shows graciousness to us. So that's just another thing that I'm going to be thinking more about.
That's a really good point. And especially in this time of where there is so much suffering and where, you know, so we are so limited. I'm just thinking about these monks living their lives in the harshness of the desert, and how gratitude for those small things, and, you know, saying thank you for the fact of when having water, food, you know, things that could easily be otherwise, was an important practice for them. And how in our own time, where the challenges and the suffering is so much on the surface, finding that the ability to draw up gratitude for those things that do persist, and that those gifts that God continues to give, is a valuable practice alongside the continual prayer of the Jesus prayer, whatever form our praying continuously takes. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for taking the time on this Sunday evening to be with us, to inform us more about this wonderful tradition, to kind of plant these seeds of the Jesus prayer that I imagine will take fruit in many of us. I know for me, it was such a good reminder of this ancient practice, and one that I've lost in my own prayer life and look forward to reclaiming.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. Like, it really was a joy. And, you know, people had great questions and you're all so attentive. So, you know, I'd encourage you to try giving this a try, maybe before Compline or possibly after Compline. And, you know, it really was, it was great to be with you this evening. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Liza.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you, Liza.
Thank you,
And
Liza.
join us next week. Thanks for the plug, Liza. We will be talking about praying with icons and the Russian tradition, saints in the Russian tradition. So we'll look at a couple figures and focus in on the practice of praying with icons. So I look forward to seeing you all then.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night, all.
Good night.